And we're live. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Late again, because because I'm talking about the EU Migration Pact, and it's complicated. And there's always something, and there's a detail regarding the pact that I was unsure about, and it's still a little bit funny. And I spent the last half an hour looking it up. Anyway, thanks for joining me. So tonight I want to talk about, as I mentioned, the EU Migration Pact. I want to talk about mental illness a little bit. I saw a video today from Stella O'Malley. She's an Irish psychotherapist and author, and it just gave me this idea. Anyway, leading on to the euthanasia. There's been a lot of discussion recently about euthanasia in liberal Western democracies, Western liberal democracies, Canada, the Netherlands as such. Now, but more to come probably. So it's something I haven't really paid much attention to, but this thing I saw about mental illness from this author got me thinking about it. Anyway, so there's a lot to it actually, and it's kind of connected back to the Migration Pact a little bit. It's kind of a holistic discussion I want to go into tonight. So I'll just check everybody's okay in the chat and that something isn't gone wrong. You know, every time I stream, it's like something you just have to be doing 5 nights a week or very regularly, I find anyway, because or just you need to be in a consistent mindset with it, because there's all sorts of finicky little things. If your mic isn't muted, there's something else. If it's not that, it's something else, etc., etc. So credit to streamers who have it, put together. When you're watching, you don't realize that even the simplest of streams, there's like 10 different little dials you need to be kind of getting right at any given time. And tonight, a night where I'm on time, I'm happy out. I'm researching this migration pact and this key detail of it, which I've been watching people talk about it for the last few nights, or it's been on the timeline for a few days, and everyone's trotting out the same numbers and the same details, and I just took it for granted. I just thought, well, everybody's talking about it. Like the general facts I'm gleaning from the timeline are the facts, and that's grand. And then just before I go live, I think I'm just going to give a general riff about it. I'm not going to give a detailed, breaking down every letter in the document. There's a variety of documents, but I'm not going to go through it with a fine tooth comb. That's not what I do. And lengthy legislation and all of that. I'm just going to talk about the general idea. And then it occurred to me that, well, yeah, that's well and good, but I better look at some of the basic details if I'm going to talk to you about it. And the biggest detail, I'll just cut to it. I'll start talking about it now. But it was that how many Ireland is meant to take, So the idea of the pact, I suppose I'll start talking about the pact. Basically, the key detail is like how many each country is meant to take and all of this and how it reflects to Ireland. And we assume what the number is. And then I wasn't sure. Checked it up with people in the meantime, checked it up as much as I can. And I'm fairly sure of what it is. But anyway, it just goes to show you through reading about it too, trying to get into detail, unless you were in a full-time job or like in a legal profession or studying it almost full-time, what you can see when you look into these type of initiatives and legislations is that it's endlessly complicated. It's like you hear about this in the US a lot when things go through Congress and all of that nobody reads it. You see Willie O'D in the Dáil in Ireland, the Irish Parliament. People talk about not reading these things, and it's usually down to lazy politicians who don't care, but it's also something to do with how long-winded these things are. So the EU Migration Pact, anyway, was first introduced in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and it was I have in front of me here actually just this little short paragraph on it that proposed to the EU Commission in September 2020, and then it says following a consultation with various stakeholders, and it's you know where I'm going with this. You know how I talk about these things, but following consultation with various stakeholders, it's the one stakeholder that's missing probably in this entire conversation would be the majority of people in the EU, the majority of citizens, the alleged ruled population, the demos in Europe. we consistently see that majorities are against mass immigration in the West, in Europe. The people who elected to no avail, Georgia Maloney, and the majority of people in Ireland are against it. You have a lot of stats on that, but yeah, so they're not consulted. You have every NGO, 500 billion NGOs are consulted, but not the people. So anyway, the idea of the Migration Pact ostensibly is to regularize and control the flow of external migrants into Europe. So this is not the internal labor market or free movement within the EU. This is migrants external to the EU. So North Africans, everything from there to probably Burmese or whatever, anyone in the world basically. It could be a potential asylum seeker, but it's the sell on it is that it would regularize it and formalize it, so you would be sort of getting details of migrants on entry points, so that they wouldn't be getting lost in the EU. They would be getting fingerprinted. They wouldn't be getting shopping around the entire continent back and forth, like you have guys in Dublin outside the International Protection Centre in tents who've been in London for 2 years and all this kind of stuff. So it's to get rid of that. And it's kind of interesting because that is one of the big complaints. They're unvetted. We don't know who they are. Now, it's unclear how the Migration Pact affects that, because even if they are fingerprinted at the point of entry, let's say in southern Italy or in Greece, I don't think it succeeds in explaining how you vet. This is the big buzz term everybody uses. How you vet that person all the way back to a village in Malawi or somewhere, right? Take Malawi or some other country like that, where their civil service is barely intact anyway. Zimbabwe, the Congo, someone from Katanga province in the middle of nowhere, with a semi-failed state. I don't see how they can be vetted all the way back to the point of origin, when the point of origin is such a basket case to begin with. But anyway, it alleges to assuage people maybe of that fear in some way. At least someone doesn't go around murdering people in France and show up in Ireland the next day and have a new identity. That's the sell. I'm just giving the devil its due there. And maybe they're sort of selling it as well in order to limit and control the migration, right? An answer to the migration crisis of 2016. So it was proposed in 2020, but like I say, they were consulting stakeholders from like 2016 onwards. This has been in the works for a while. It's the EU's attempt, or alleged attempt, to formalize and put shape on the asylum and migration situation, one and the same thing basically. But I mean, what it comes with, the crux of it, some people are talking about numbers, and I'll get to this number thing I mentioned at the start, which is that people have been saying, and I'm going to be checking my phone as I go because I might get updates. Like I say, this is more complicated than it seems at the outset, so I just didn't have time to get it absolutely for sure, but take my word for it for now, and correct me if I'm wrong. People have been talking about 30,000, so that member states would have to take a minimum of 30,000 people, or pay for every one they don't take. Beyond that, again, people are putting different numbers out there. For everyone they wouldn't take beyond that, you would have to pay 20,000 per asylum seeker, and the argument goes that it would be worth it because an asylum seeker as it stands costs more anyway to house and feed and everything else. But basically you either take, regardless of whatever number is in the situation, the idea is that you would have to pay for the ones that you don't take, effectively, of your allotted share. And there's this whole sort of formula for how many each nation state, or each state should take, member state as they call it, should take, based on GDP and based on population size, which on the face of it seems logical. Now, a lot of people have been putting out this 30,000 number, and this is the reason I was late, because and I am checking my phone as I go, but I was under the impression that it was 30,000, but when I started reading about it, what I started to see is that they're trotting out the 30,000 number as a EU-wide number, and each state from that number would be delegated a certain amount. And what the Irish Examiner were saying, and one or two other sources were saying, is that based on this GDP population size formula, that Ireland would have to take a minimum, I think, of 648 asylum seekers. Now, look, if that were the case, then we're laughing. Now, personally, I would think that's still too many, but the idea that it would go down to 683, I mean, in 2023, Ireland took 250,000 migrants. I don't know how many of those were asylum seekers. There's been like well over 6 figures worth of Ukrainians have come here. You could say that's a war-torn country. It obviously is, but a lot of Ukrainians, of course, don't live in the eastern side of Ukraine where there's actually war, which I'll get onto. I want to talk about the whole concept of asylum seeking in general. I've had a view on that for a while. I kind of want to talk about it, but you know, this idea that if it were 648, sorry, that Ireland had to take, and you know, if they were to sell it to us as that, it's sort of like it's one of those things that you just can't take at face value. That Ireland can take 648, and for every one of those we don't want to take, we pay 20 grand, and that could come to like 500-600 million or whatever it is. Again, I apologize for not being able to bring you the entire machinery of this thing, because there's too much in it, I think, for that, for me anyway. It's sources I would recommend, by the way, if you're interested. Keith Woods did a short breakdown on this. It's light on the details, like I am right now. Like the finer details, the 6,000 pages on it or whatever. Una McGurk, a barrister, she did you can find her Twitter or YouTube. She did like a 10-minute video about the constitutional ramifications of it, which I'll talk about. Tracy O'Mahony did a video on it, and John McGurk wrote a short piece for Gript about it too, which was decent enough. But again, a lot of these videos, just like what I'm telling you here, they're kind of skimming over the surface a little bit. An EU bureaucrat could come back with their sort of 6,000 page document and you know, quibble about this or that detail, and they could claim, as they do, that it will regularize and reduce migration and all of this. I don't think it's kind of the point, to be honest, because we all know that provided the 648 number is correct, that's not what we're getting. That's not what we're getting now. It's been a long time. Sorry. It's been a long time. It's been a long time since we've had 648 asylum seekers, merely that number coming to Ireland, and it's going to be a long time yet, and it certainly won't be changed by this migration pact. As Keith alluded to in his video, and I mean some of the others maybe, you know, we're dealing with the EU here. These are the ones who have brought the situation to what it is now. Like they and other institutions too, but Ireland didn't go about this by itself. We have a corrupt government. We had a corrupt government under Charles Haughey, and we had a corrupt government under Bertie Ahern, and even under Bertie Ahern, it wasn't as bad as this, if I'm not mistaken. Although it might have been for a while, but they're just the tail being wagged. It's under these EU auspices. This is happening. This whole concept of basically the whole world can come to Europe and get shelter, get a new life, live the dream, you know, go out on dates with Pamela Anderson or whatever they think they're going to be doing, right? And have like a 5-bedroom, you know, semi-D or whatever. But that's they don't come up through Africa to arrive at Ireland. A lot of them probably have halfway up the continent might not be familiar with the country of Ireland to begin with. They're coming to Europe. They're coming to the main attractions are Germany, England, Spain, Netherlands. You know, they're all coming up in their Barcelona jerseys or whatever. And it's not a national attraction. The attraction is Europe, and the attraction is the EU. As I put in my thumbnail, a bunch of African lads with the EU flag draped around them. I think that was in southern Spain or North Morocco, that territory they have there. But yeah, they drape themselves in the EU flag. That's the EU nation state, state is the state that talks about replacement migration. The idea that by 2030 or 2040 or whatever, that we're going to have a waning demographic and this and that. Thus, we need 4 million, 10 million, 50 million, 100 million, whatever. You'll hear different numbers quoted at different times under different circumstances. We need this huge amount of Africans and others to replace a declining demographic. This is coming from the EU, and you can debate, oh, it's higher than the EU, it's the US empire and all this, but the administrative root of this, at least in an administrative sense, is the EU. The EU in its entirety, the Commission, the permanent dictatorship that is the EU. That's where this comes from. And so the idea that they would claim to be, I could see in the chat all the videos that I mentioned recommended. You're all talking about like where the links are and stuff. Talk about killing my own viewership, maybe, perhaps. These are really good videos, but no, they are good, and I do recommend watching them. But I'm basing a discussion not just on them, just on the whole thing. I think it deserves a good long-winded ramble. So stick around. But so. They cannot be trusted. The EU cannot be trusted to suddenly, oh, we're here for you. We're here to regularize this thing and reduce this crisis. They themselves named it the migrant crisis, like the cost of living crisis, everything crisis, this kind of crisisology. They even put a term on it. They introduced it as a phenomenon. These people didn't arrive in Europe on their own. They were basically allowed and invited. And then they turn around and say that they're trying to solve the problem. But then they're also talking about wanting 50 billion Africans within the next 40 years or whatever. So, they're obviously, to say they're not to be trusted is kind of totally understating it and ridiculous to even say in a way. But so the important thing is not so much the numbers that they're putting out, various numbers. Some say it's 30,000. I think it actually is the true number that they're suggesting for Ireland is 648, which again on paper would be great, but that's ridiculous. The important part is that they will take sovereignty over our border, which doesn't exist anyway, to be honest, nor does any European border internally, obviously, but externally. The borders within and outside of Europe don't exist. They're effectively like magnets or hoovers, just bringing people in, as opposed to borders, as opposed to like keeping people out. And that's in reality, that's in effect, regardless of the law. The real problem with the Migration Pact is that it's going to cede, in a formal sense, control of the borders of European nation states to the EU in Brussels. Effectively, that's, if I were to sum it up, that's it. And that is a problem because we always hear about moral and legal obligations. Ireland is a particularly good case for this because we have, over the course of like the last 20 years, there was Lisbon 2 and there was something else. Watch Una McGurk for that. I hope I didn't say Una Mullally a while ago. It's definitely not her. Una McGurk. She does a good video. She's like a legal eagle, and she has all of the jargon and the various pieces of legislation on the tip of her tongue. But Ireland is known for having opt-out clauses to all of the migration stuff, basically, as a result of various pieces of legislation and referenda, reruns of referendums in the last 20 years. So much like Denmark is supposed to have a similar kind of setup, they actually act on it a bit more. But the point being is that when greasy, slippery Irish politicians come to us and they say, well, we have moral and legal obligations, we have no choice but to put these 500 people in some field in Wicklow or whatever. When they say that, we can't really challenge them in it because they can just come in with police. They can come in with batons and just beat people up while they're saying it. And what are you going to do? But at least you have the truth on your side, that you can say to them, even though you're not listening to me, even though you're pushing me out of the way, even though you're sort of a completely authoritarian, non-responsive state, hostile to your own people, even though that might be true, what I can definitely say is when you tell me we have moral and legal obligations, put aside the moral, when you tell me we have legal obligations, we do not. And insofar as we do, we could totally opt out of those. So it is on you. We can still point to you as the functioning ruler as regards this migration replacement situation. You can say we have moral and legal obligations, but we don't, and we can hang that over you. And thus ultimately hold you completely responsible, regardless of your lies. Um, the thing about signing up to this fully is that they can say we have legal obligations because we've signed up to this. Now, it still is, to my mind, illegitimate because nobody's being consulted, but they can say it, and strictly speaking, it will be true. You can come back and qualm that, well, we weren't consulted. Oh, this doesn't make sense. This isn't really any kind of democracy. The truth of the matter is, in its own way, illegitimate because of the background to it. But at the end of the day, strictly speaking, it will be true when they say we have legal obligations to a point, to a point that it isn't the case now. And that obviously matters. According to Una McGurk and Tracy O'Mahony, both legal people, I don't know I'm not going to pretend I'm never going to try to pretend to know more than I do. But according to them, and according to John McGurk as well, once we sign up to this, there's no unsigning up to it. Now, I obviously dispute that because I'm like radical, and I don't believe in all this nonsense. This kind of this whole international agreement thing. To me, it's completely nonsense. It would be legitimate if it were voted in by a vast majority or something like that. But when it's not like that, this is completely nonsense. It's not worth the paper it's written on, to my mind. But to the mind of the average bureaucracy, the governing elite, the civil service, whatever, if you're looking at it from that perspective, once this is signed up to, it's irreversible in effect. Again, I don't know. Could you elect a nationalist government in a overwhelming dictatorial level of a majority, and technically maybe they could undo it? I mean, according to these guys, it can't be undone. I don't know. Again, like I say, my view is like if a piece of paper from the EU says that you cannot reverse it because you, like some politicians who didn't consult you, you signed up to it, it can't be reversed. To me, when I hear that, it's like when people talk about maritime law, or they talk about like something like that. No disrespect, like, to anyone who believes in either EU or maritime law, but my view is always like, it's a piece of paper, okay? Like, what matters is who's in power and who calls the shots and who gets to decide what the exception is. So basically, who gets to make the rules and then who gets to break the rules. That's what matters. So I suppose I'm saying two things in a way. In one sense, I'm saying that yes, it's very, and two things can be true at once. In one sense, this migration pact is important. It's been pushed through the Dáil and the Oireachtas, the first stage of whatever it is, and the first round of sort of this whole system. Again, I won't pretend to know more than I do. There's a kind of silly process of like putting it through a couple of stages of consultation. The important one, the first one, after which no more debate can be added in or no more questions can be asked about it, sort of thing, has already been pushed through in the Dáil with these ridiculous politicians who don't represent anyone in the country. Again, let me remind you that the vast majority in pretty much every poll that's been done are against mass immigration in Ireland now, and specifically the asylum industry. So they are not representing anyone in there, but they've pushed it through, and it's kind of almost like a formality to finalize it now, which is why these various people who are trying to raise attention on it or raise awareness are pleading with you and pleading with everybody to try and make noise about it. The hate speech bill was stymied, at least for a while, by Irish people speaking up about it and international people picking up on it and all that. So I do think it's not unworthy of pushing back on, in the sense that it's worthy of being pushed back on, because perhaps it could bear fruit and be stopped in some sense, which would be a moral victory at least, and two, because it's it's functionally bad. It really will hand our sovereignty over. So I don't know. I in that sense, I think it's worth being pushed back on. But then in a different sense, I have this sort of hand waving glibness about the whole thing, and I don't want to discourage enthusiasm about this pushback on it, but there's this feeling of like, well, they're talking about potentially 648 asylum seekers, but we know that could and will spiral because they have emergency clauses, which others have said this could be used for climate emergency, or before you know it, economic deprivation is a form of asylum, and so everybody in the world is potentially able to avail of asylum, and it can be changed at a whim, and it's already up to anybody's definition within the bureaucracies and the NGOs. But even at that, so it can be expanded to so-called emergencies. But it's the trouble is that they're already doing that. So the idea of like, oh well, if we sign the pact, they can just totally expand it to whatever. It's kind of like they haven't expanded to. They're basically doing what they want, is what I'm saying. We had a Dublin regulation that was meant to limit people to the country of origin where they first go to, and over the years, the Dublin regulation was kind of changed and altered and picked away at and interpreted differently. And effectively now, if you go to any so-called legal professional NGO person about migration and you wave the Dublin regulation in their face, they'll go, "Oh, you don't understand it." No, that doesn't mean what it says it means. It just changes. If if I say to Helen McEntee or Roderick O'Gorman or any NGO person, well, why is an Algerian? Why is a Nigerian? Why are Georgians? I mean, they're Albanians. They're on the Irish countries of safe origin. Why are they here? Why aren't they just turned around at the airport and told, go home? Like, you don't even get to the stage of mentioning the word asylum. You don't get to apply for asylum. You don't get to sit at the desk. You're just going home. And you're going to be fingerprinted and photographed. And you're never allowed back in this country again because of what you tried to do, right? This is nonsense. Or you should effectively be arrested for doing that. But they don't do that. We have Georgians and Albanians and Algerians in centres anyway. I mean, so you can bring the law, you can bring common sense, you can bring any of this to them, and they just give you two fingers. So it's kind of like, it's almost, in one sense, I feel like it's almost moot, So, but I want to temper that by saying it is important. It's worth pushing back on. There are several reasons why it's worth pushing back on, whether you succeed or not, and whether succeeding itself is a success practically anyway. Regardless of that, there are reasons to push back on it anyway. First off, it's a moral victory. It's a sort of a win. Like I say, a moral victory, but kind of a political victory in a sense. And then just the basic idea that, like, even if things are bad, there's nothing wrong with stopping something from getting worse, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know. So let's see if I have anything else on it. Yeah, it is what it is. I think most of you get the idea. There are some technicalities that I'm probably missing. The question of how many numbers will it be exactly will be up to interpretation to some extent. And also, more importantly, it doesn't matter because those can change at a moment's notice anyway. So it's kind of bullshit. The substance of this migration pact, because we know it can be altered and changed at any moment, the substance is bullshit. What matters is the handing over of sovereignty on migration in a formal sense. Because, like I say, apologies if I'm repeating myself, but we've handed over the sovereignty in reality. So you could just say, well, what's the difference? But to hand it over formally just makes it worse. They can say, well, we can't undo it. We've done it now. We actually have legal obligations. This is how it is. So it's not good. And then, of course, even if a nationalist or a right-wing or a conservative government got into power, they would be left with this pact hung around their necks that they can be heavily sanctioned for not abiding by, even though they were elected to reduce migration. Well, they now, even though it might have started at 648, which is hilarious, it might have started at that, but fast forward, now it's 2029. A nationalist government has been elected on the platform of reducing migration, but the EU are like, oh yeah, that 648 is now 120,000 because, of course, the war in Sudan, climate change, desertification in the Sahel, There was a storm in Turkmenistan. Now we need to bring 400,000 of them. Whatever. It's a big world, and there's always some nonsense excuse. So now it's a case that the EU can effectively put you in sanctions if you don't take this 120,000 people. It's now morphed into 120,000. And even, yes, you might be a nationalist government. Yes, you might have been elected, but your own national signature is on it here now. So we're effectively going to cripple your economy. And in the international arena, you don't really even have comeback because we're all used to it now. We're all signed up to this. It is what it is. And then it becomes a choice between leaving the EU, which is complicated and troublesome, or accepting this blank check for migrants and that you yourself have supposedly signed up to. So I hope that kind of sells it, that it is worth pushing back on. Just make noise about it, write to your politicians, etc. The other thing, just to kind of go on with this as well, is that like we're debating whether or not we should sign up to this, or the perils of us, Ireland. I say us, it's ridiculous. The us, like Roderick O'Gorman, Irish people, there is no us there. But the idea of Ireland, the state of Ireland, signing up to this, debating the peril of that, it's kind of like, well, we are also, just to demonstrate how nonsensical this whole thing is in general, this premise of these international treaties on migration and big issues like that. We're signed up to the 1951 UN protocol on asylum seekers. Now, people just accept that. People just accept, even people who are against mass migration and plantation, a lot of people will just accept it. Like this whole thing you hear all the time about genuine asylum seekers, I just have huge trouble with that. And I'll never be like this kind of moderate, so it is what it is. I'm just telling you what I believe. I think I'm moderate because I'm right. But compared to the nonsense and the various silly mainstream narratives that are out there, I'm not moderate. But hear me out, and I think it's reasonable, is that should never have been signed up to. A global pact on asylum seekers, that you have to take them. And it's it's non-specific, it's global. Every country in the world has signed up to it for every other country in the world. But then, so it's bad to begin with, but it's also signed up to without anyone's consultation. It's just one of these post-World War II, post kind of Bretton Woods things that the Western Allied Alliance, post-war alliance, decided on. So the IMF and this and that and everything else, that all just got done. There was no election had in France or in Ireland or in Canada or Poland or anywhere else, or Australia or any of it. There was no referendum had on that. So it's like the ultimate global anti-democratic act, in a sense, beginning there. It's not just a United Nations thing where it's a Geneva Convention on like, oh, let's not gas people in war, let's not torture people, let's you try to give people access to water. This is very different. This is about that you can't refoul or return people to countries of origin when they seek asylum. And again, on the face of it, even then you could have said, well, that's going to be rare enough, and we don't have like modern transport and internet and interconnectedness in the world, in the sense, like I say, in terms of plane and internet and all of that, planes and internet. So it's a very different world. And even then it didn't make sense. But then fast forward 80 years, 70 years, 75 years. I've got an itchy nose. It's annoying me. But fast forward and it's, oh man, I'm just going to scratch it. But so, we now have a totally different world. And now you have mass movements of millions of people being shipped around the place. And maybe back in the day, the general interpretation was that the asylum was going to be legitimate. Like there's a war, and some people are going to call into their neighboring country. They're going to be given water and basic medical care very temporarily until it's done. They're not going to really have rights in a massive sense. They're going to have those basic rights to asylum. And it's somewhat at the country's discretion. It's a general agreement. But when the said war is over, or even dies down or whatever, or even dies down in a region of that country, which a country is very rarely entirely at war, the idea will be that this is an unpleasant situation for both refugee and for host. So we're just getting people back home. It's got nothing to do with whether their home country is poor, whether they like it or not, whether they've settled down and they like the new country. It's nothing to do with that. It really is just like you're not going to look across a fence and watch someone die. You're not going to watch a woman and a child get shot to death. You're going to say, "Come on in here," and as soon as your thing is over, and while you're here, it's very much at our own discretion and how we want you to be here, in whatever way we want you to be here, and you will be grateful for it, because ultimately the basic premise of what we're giving you is the ability to just remain alive, because you've got nothing to do with this war that's happening around you. And when it's done, you go home, no questions about it. That would be, I mean, even that I would, well, on a basic level, if it's two bordering countries and all that, you could accept that. But what it is now is just totally different. It's a way of facilitating replacement migration into Western countries. That's all it is. Not only that, but it creates a two-tier system where asylum seekers can access all of these services and natives can't. And I've said this many times, but take Ireland, for example. The only functional criteria, the only effective criteria for applying for asylum in Ireland and potentially being granted asylum or granted international protection applicant status or granted leave to remain or whatever other bullshit, basically being brought in and just being looked after. The only functional criteria for that is that you are not Irish. And people sort of don't really grasp when I'm saying that. Like, that is the only criteria, because you can be from Georgia, you can be from Albania and having lived in London for 2 years, you can be from Algeria, which has no war going on at all, or the list goes on. You can be from those, and that can even be known. And you can just sort of, through various appeals and ride the system and the NGOs helping you out, and that's by design, you can end up staying here in effect. So when you actually, some NGO person will say, well, no, technically there is a list of asylum criteria, but I'm talking about functionally. In effect, in reality, the only way you can walk into an asylum application office and have them just laugh you out of the building and just say, it's not that we're rejecting you formally, we're not accepting your application. The only way you can achieve that realistically is to go in and just say, I'm Irish. That then they will say, well, now you are making a laughing stock of the concept, because obviously you're in Ireland and you are Irish and you're applying for asylum in Ireland, so that rules you out. I could say back to that person, well, this person is from Georgia, which you list as a safe country, and they're telling you they're from Georgia. And they have a criminal record in Georgia, and just, so like, this doesn't this just make just as much a mockery of it? And they say, well, we say no. So we say that's we entertain that. We don't entertain you. So there's no, again, the logic completely breaks down, and the only functional logic you were left with that actually makes sense is that you cannot apply for it exclusively if you were Irish. That's the only thing that bars you from it. And what it opens up to you is housing. It opens up dental care, all the basics, right? If you're an asylum seeker, you don't necessarily have to be cold. You can be staying in a 400,000 euro, and when it gets over full, some end up in tents because there's 200,000 odd people here or whatever. But generally speaking, you can end up in a hotel or whatever. And if you're cold, you can write to your liaison officer or whatever and say, oh, I'm cold in here. The guy you're paying millions to in your contract, get on his case or whatever. And it's not just seen as, oh, well, that's your problem, or you are basically babied by the state. You're not just given UBI, universal basic income, which would be outlandish to begin with, but it's not just universal basic income. It's universal basic parenting, almost. That's the only thing I can, it's analogous to, is parenting. The way my kids don't have to think about or be responsible for the electricity bill. So that's and yet they can enjoy the lights and everything else, right? Because they're kids. I take care of that for them. It's the same basically for so-called asylum seekers. They don't just get their, say, their heating paid for. It's that they don't have to call up the guy, the oil guy, and arrange for it to be put in and then make sure that the money is there. And like I'm saying, it's not even about the money. That's taken, we know that's taken care of, but they don't have to do anything. They get to live as as children of the state effectively. Um, and that's a big deal, especially when things get tight, and things are always tight basically for Native people, the majority of Native people. And people have to look after their own lives, and they have to wait for years to see a dentist and all of this. And you don't have a rep, you don't have an agent or a liaison officer or a number you can call for help necessarily. You don't have one point of contact for someone to just help you with something you're deprived of. That doesn't really exist. So, that's a long way from 1951. I think the 1951 thing was nonsense to begin with, but you just come back to this idea as well of like what a genuine asylum seeker is. So some people would say, well, provided that you're vetted and you arrived with a passport, and provided you're not from Georgia or Albania, let's say there's a war in Sudan. I think there is, right? But there's always a war in Sudan, I think. But there's always a war somewhere, and there are always potentially millions of people who are displaced. And you cannot have a situation where even a so-called genuine asylum seeker, let's say there's a big war between Myanmar and whatever borders Myanmar, India, Thailand, I don't know, whatever. Let's say there's a war between India and Pakistan, right? Two massive populations. And suddenly there are 300 million displaced people. And they're suggesting that Ireland, as if we don't already take enough Indians in through normal channels, now they're suggesting, well, Ireland needs to take 400,000 Indians / Pakistanis into Ireland or whatever, just hypothetically. It's like, if every one of them is vetted, that they don't have a criminal record, they have their passport ready at the airport customs, they aren't committing crime or whatever, they're in a facility that is not near a child's playground or whatever, and all of the usual sort of qualms are out of the way, are you to tell me that, well, they're genuine asylum seekers, and because there were 200 million of them displaced between these two massive countries, when you break it down for Ireland, it's like hundreds of thousands of people or whatever? Just go with me hypothetically, or climate refugees or whatever. But no, let's stick to war. It's as legitimate as you can get, right? They genuinely are fleeing war. We can't just do that. We can't just have hundreds of thousands of Indians and Pakistanis, and of course, 6 years later, once we've gone through all the turmoil and consternation and the deprivation of Irish people, having to accept that and facilitate that. 6 years later, or what? Now it's China and America and Taiwan and Taiwanese. Like it's always something. And so even the most, and these are never really legitimate cases. Even Ukraine is nonsense in a way, but even the most hypothetically genuine situations, it's not sustainable. You just can't do that. So I don't buy it. I think I'll put it another way. To me, the only genuine asylum seeker, in a logical sense, would be, this is the quickest, easiest way to think about it, would be like some sort of international general guideline on how these things might work, just based on international courtesy. Would be, you have like what a genuine asylum seeker in Ireland would look like, where, say there were some freak natural disaster in Britain, Iceland, Scandinavia, and perhaps Netherlands, Germany, France, let's say, the northwestern corner of Europe. If there was a freak natural disaster in one of those countries and hundreds of thousands of people were genuinely displaced, it would be divided proportionally, and they really couldn't just go nearby. It would be divided where most people go as near as possible, and then as you go further away linguistically, culturally, and all of that, and smaller population, just like the EU Migration Pact suggests, within those countries, Ireland would take some of them at our own discretion, out of just neighbourly courtesy, we would take them and we would facilitate them in basic standards. So you don't put them in the gulag, but there's no necessarily minimum standard for them. It's just you're going to treat them well, you're going to be hospitable, but they don't have an endless list of rights and lawyers, solicitors, and NGOs, and all of these kind of structures behind them. Not really. It's just at our discretion because of this issue to a limited number that we can handle without being disrespectful to our own population. We will take that fair and reasonable number in a certain facility or area for a limited period of time. And when your country, within probably, hopefully, a couple of months, just emergency measures, get sorted out, you are returned. And you are, because you're the most sort of hypothetically genuine asylum seeker, you will say, thank you very much. You kept me alive. I would have just died there because of all the magma or, tsunami or whatever it is. And now it's kind of safe. I want to return home because I'm not a migrant. I'm not an opportunist. I genuinely was seeking asylum, safety, the ability to remain alive. And now I'm going home because I want to go home. I never chose to come here anyway. That's what a genuine asylum seeker would be like. And that's what, when we get 50,000 Africans or whatever who were just taking the piss, obviously, they're trying to frame the latter under the moral the moral tone of the former, which is ridiculous. It's complete. We have detached realities entirely, and that's what it would be to me, And so if there was an issue in Southeast Asia, people would go from Thailand, as they did in China. I think during the Vietnam War, sometime around there, a handful of maybe 100,000 or whatever Vietnamese went to China. But they went into China, the bordering area, where the border is kind of porous anyway, like culturally. Like the people in that, forget the Yunnan province in China, are sort of ethnically Vietnamese anyway. The border is a little bit arbitrary. So they took some of them in for a while. In fact, what it was is that the people were actually ethnically Chinese. I think that's what it was. So they basically took their own. Much like if there was a situation in Ireland or in America and we took some Irish Americans from New York and Boston temporarily or something. That makes sense. That's logical. It's human. It's based on natural tolerances and all of that. It's putting like people with like. It's temporary. It's not got overbearing conditions on it. And that might make some sense. But what we have is nonsense. So you could talk about the EU Migration Pact and say, that hands over a certain amount of sovereignty on paper. But of course, 1951 handed over sovereignty on paper to some extent as well. Further to that, China has signed up to I keep mentioning China, my pet friend China. I like talking. They're a good example, but they're signed up to that. Almost every country has signed up to that. China has also signed up to several others that have emerged over the years. Basic kind of treaties on asylum seekers or whatever. They just don't take any. Singapore just doesn't take any. Tunisia, they were chucking them out recently. No one really cared too much about that. They were chucking people out who were coming up from sub-Saharan Africa. But it's a nonsense in every direction. It was a nonsense to start with. It's turned into a whole other type of nonsense. Then it's based as an international treaty, but many countries, major players in the world, they're signed up to it, but they just don't do it. So the whole thing is completely nonsense, top to bottom, and that includes the Migration Pact, the EU Migration Pact, the UN Migration Pact, 1951. I would say, on the grand scheme of things, the whole concept needs to be completely thrown in the bin. From scratch, pre-1951, pre-World War II, it is a complete nonsense. What it turned into is a nonsense, and it was kind of a nonsense to begin with anyway. And especially with what's gone on, it just has to go. So, they can talk about 648 people allotted to Ireland. We know that'll morph into 648,000 or whatever. But it's all moot in a sense. What really matters is the sovereignty question is what matters. It's like, do we have countries or not? Do we have equality, so-called, or not? Because he can apply for asylum from Georgia even though that's bullshit under your own conditions, but I can't apply because I'm Irish. This is crazy. And it would be crazy if it was for 50 people. That would be outlandish and unfair. But it's not 50 people. It's not 50,000 people. It's 100. It's 150. It's 200,000 people in a small country like Ireland. The whole thing has to go. So even though it's important to try to push back on this pact, but it goes so far beyond that. That would be to stop things getting quantitatively worse, or qualitatively worse, actually. It would be to stop that, and that would be good, just like with the recent referendum. But nothing's gained. Practically speaking, nothing got better. Just like the referendum on so-called women in the home, it was sort of moot in a sense to begin with anyway. While it was good to stop it, it was kind of moot because, of course, women did not have the right to remain at home comfortably with their children if they so chose to. That hasn't been possible for decades in Ireland, which is another story. So it's sort of like, well, yeah, okay, it's a good moral victory, and it is good to stop things kind of getting potentially worse. But the true essence is the political power undergirding the whole thing, which is just this complete detachment from any form of realistic democracy. You know, I don't know. Maybe I should just leave it. I think I've talked about it enough, but it's like I just don't want to leave anything on the field. You know, anything else I wanted to talk about? Yeah, it's just going to be altered on the fly, etc. But again, final thought, or to repeat a thought, is that we are pushing back successfully on a political and cultural, at least on a cultural or meta-political sense in Ireland on migration. We've won the battle, hearts and minds of the whole country. We have that. So it would be a real pity if, while we're winning the hearts and minds, and it just goes to show how bad things are, while we're doing that, our government, through the back door, cedes sovereignty over migration to Brussels. And what even is Brussels but just the commission, just completely faceless, like kind of O'Brien hiding behind the office or whatever. I don't know, but you know what I mean. It's like a caricature of like Soviet detachment from the people, Politburo, all of that. While Ireland, the hearts and minds are totally against migration, people are crying out against it on a national and a local level. The government decide that that's the time to hand sovereignty over to a faceless man behind a curtain, basically, and then just come back to us and say, "Well, now I really can't do anything for you. I'm not the guy you need to talk to." And then you say, "Well, who should I talk to then?" They go, "Talk to Brussels." You go, "What's Brussels?" They go, "I don't know, just a series of a million NGOs and just this bizarre entity that has no attachment or relationship to any population's wishes at all." That's not good. So it's a pity that we can't, our energies cannot be directed towards saying we want a referendum on whether we stop mass immigration and guarantee an Irish majority, and blah blah blah. We want a referendum on that, yes or no. And if it's no, or if we say we do want to stop all of that, then it will be put into effect. That would be a reasonable democracy. That would be a worthy reward for the political capital that's been raised over the last few years and the seething that's going on in Ireland at the moment about it among the people overall. That would be a real win. That's the conversation we should be having. And yet, in this situation, we're having a conversation about whether we can keep it as it is, the status quo of 100,000+ people coming in every year, or whether we cede our sovereignty to the people who ultimately created that situation, but are now telling us it's potentially 648, but it's not going to be anyway. We should cede sovereignty to them. It's crazy that this is what it is, but that we might not like that, but it's still worth. It's like putting a halt on that is a good starting point for the next conversation, which is, okay, now we've stopped it getting worse. Now we've stopped you being able to wash your hands of it. Now we want answers on it. It does matter. It does matter because in 3 or 4 years or whenever it is, if we have a kind of nationalist minority or majority or whatever it is in government, or an X amount of years, then it would be better that we didn't have to deal with this, that we actually have our right that in theory, if we elected the right government in Ireland, we would be able to legitimately, even under their own nonsense EU laws, legitimately say, we're out of all this. We're not doing it anymore. We're going back to an effective asylum policy like we might have had in the 80s or whatever. Bare minimum set by us. We will have discretion over what's legitimate or not. Like, we'll really enforce like the most sparse version of the 1951 convention or whatever possible. We'll enforce that as we see fit. If they take that off the table, our populist sort of uprising will be that much more complicated. So on that basis, having said everything else, it is worth pushing back on. So yeah, so anyway, I might move on to the next thing. So I this is more casual, right? So I wanted to talk about the Migration Pact. Hopefully I did it justice. This is more casual. So I was watching, I just popped up on my Twitter, but Stella O'Malley, who is this I think it's a psychotherapist as opposed to a psychologist or whatever, a psychiatrist. I don't know what the difference. She's one of those, and she's an author. She's written various books on how to raise your teen and stuff like that. Like an author with several successful books, mainstream. And then in the last few years, she's written books on criticizing the trans industry, effectively. So she's taken a turn into the sort of turn off the reservation slightly, and she's probably had to face all the blowback and stuff. And I've seen her in the corner of my eye doing her thing, and she seems pretty cool and sound and intelligent and legit. But I've only ever seen the Twitter account. I've never seen her speak. So she put up this YouTube video, and I had a watch off, and it was so good. It was about, I should really have it up in front of me. I don't. That was a bit of a blunder, but let's look it up now. It's basically about euthanasia transitioning and all of that as an answer to the mental health issue of the day. Mental health being this big thing everybody's talking about. The idea that that's a salve for, it's not on her Twitter either, where is it? But I'm on Stella McCartney's page, not Stella O'Malley. But and basically the idea that, like, she really raised some fascinating points about happiness, and I just sparked some thoughts that, like, people can't be happy. The human condition is to be not unhappy, but the human condition is cruel and brutal and constant, and it never goes away, and there is no solving for it. There is no such thing ultimately as being fundamentally happy in this kind of Disneyland sense that people are striving for. And because of that, people are going to their clinical psychologists and psychiatrists or whatever else and looking for that. And when they don't get it, they're given, I'm summarizing her own videos, she says it much better than I will, but that people go looking for it, and they take these radical steps, or they're offered these radical steps to cater to what they're looking for. But of course, it's not going to do it. Transitioning or anything else, certainly not euthanasia, is going to do that for you. And it, I happen to have been thinking about it a lot lately. She calls it the link between transition medication and euthanasia. The other thing is whatever they're called, the antidepressants. What are they called? Whether it's Ritalin for ADHD or Prozac or whatever it is. It's I have stuff in front of me now, I can't even think, but it's a problem, and it sort of goes to the root, I think, of like the problem of liberalism, that people end up totally individualized and seeking pleasure maximization and have nothing else to believe in and no other real social structures. I mean, they do, practically speaking, have their lives, but liberalism, the idea is to break down ethnicity, religion, gender, family, all of these things, and that you're left being totally free. But of course, the thing that they don't say on the menu is that you're going to be left feeling extremely unhappy, and you're going to look for this sort of perfect life or a way to fix yourself, when in reality you can't fix yourself. That's not what it is to be a human being. And so they're transitioning people, they're putting them on drugs, and now they're killing people effectively. So I found this article by Spiked Online. Mad. I actually wrote something for Spiked years ago. You can look it up. My critics can find it and they can use it against me. It's one of those ones. I said, this is like 2016. I was like a sort of a liberal turned. I was like skeptical of all the lefty liberal stuff, but I came from a sort of liberal background, and I was trying to maybe appeal to the people I was writing for as well. I was probably reading Spiked at the time and tried to like pitch it and have it to their kind of taste maybe. And I was also just young and stupid, you know. But I was like, I started saying that it was about Brexit basically, and I was saying like Ireland sold its soul to the EU, and it's our shame, and that's why Irish Libs are so against Brexit, because we sold our arses to the EU, you know, with the double referendums and all that. But I started out by saying I've never been much of a nationalist, which is funny, and then I said but and carried on. But I caveated myself by saying I've never been much of a real nationalist, and I'm not really into all that. How times have changed. But so anyway, Spiked, they have this this article about a Dutch girl killing herself, basically doing euthanasia. And I know you've all heard of this before, this phenomenon of like in Canada and Netherlands. I've never really read a story about it to like confirm it. You know, it could just be an Ian Miles Chong kind of clickbait thing, or I don't know what the story is. But to actually read it as a matter of fact is crazy that people are doing this. And I can't shake the thought that this is the zenith of liberalism. The idea that, you know, it's like you're in a fancy restaurant in Manhattan and it's like you get 9 courses and they're all very small but very fancy and all of this. And every time one is brought to your table, it's a big reveal, you know, it's a big occasion, the next thing. And, you know, you start by getting, I don't know, whatever you get, women's suffrage and liberalized divorce and the right to abortion, and you get denationalization, you get the death of God, let's say, and the pushing out of God from society, basically, and religion. So you're now free of religion. That's the next course. And then the final course, the 8th course they bring out to you, and they reveal it, and it's a cyanide pill. And they go, the last thing you are shackled by is life itself. You know, you deserve the freedom to die. So you are shackled by your family. You're shackled by childbearing. You're shackled by your nation and all this nonsense. You're shackled by these diktats of God and of morality, this kind of objective, stifling morality, and this belief in the supernatural, which is we're skeptical of, and all of that. We're going to unshackle you from all those ties. And the final thing we're going to unshackle you from is the pain of life itself. The chains around you that force you to be alive. You can now have death and you can be free. It's so fitting with liberalism, and it's not a coincidence that it's come to this. And we're not even talking about the 90-year-old cancer patient who's barely alive, who wants to just put themselves out of their misery. That's a different conversation. We're talking about young people who, in many cases, don't have a physical comorbidity. They are just depressed and they can't handle it. And they're being put to death by their own so-called choice. So I'll read you the story. I can't get over this, but okay. So the woman in question in this article, her name is Yolanda. I'll call her Yolanda Fun. Her second name is Fun, which is hard to read in this story. But Yolanda Fun is scheduled to die next week on her 34th birthday. As such, she has been able to prepare the funeral invites in advance. Born from love, let go in love, reads the card. After a hard-fought life, she chose the peace she longed for. I won't read through it all. Basically, she just she said that she's usually sad, down, and gloomy. She was diagnosed with a litany of mental health problems and has had therapy, hasn't been able to hold down a job, and basically now she's killing herself, right? This was published yesterday, but it's like, it's such a theme that I think I often think about, and that's why Stella O'Malley's video, which I recommend you watch, kind of got me started on it. It's like people don't have any sort of go-to for the human condition. And I'm not talking about everyone. I'm not saying everybody's walking around like this, but I mean in a large sense, people who like either go through trauma in various ways in their life, or people who are just perpetually kind of depressed and struggling within our society, they don't have another place to really go under the culture that we have, because we have people have been kind of individualized. They have been despiritualized, so they're not really religious anymore. They couldn't really entertain that. They would think, well, if I went to the church and I got on my knees and I prayed to God for salvation and help, that would be crazy. I'd be like a religious lunatic. I'd be totally giving up on my dignity to do something like that. But they will go to their psychiatrist or whatever they're called and put themselves on drugs that they are told will make them feel okay. But, and this is clinically backed up, this is a fact in the medical field, but it's also just common intuitive sense that, well, it's anyone could tell you, anyone with common sense could tell you that if a drug purports to make you better in that sense or help you, it's obviously not making you better. What it is it's numbing you down so that you don't feel it as strongly anymore. And I just think the idea that you couldn't ask for God's salvation, for his forgiveness, for your hang-ups, your shame, your inadequacy, whatever it is your feelings are, just being touched out and foggy or whatever it is, just asking for clarity and asking for to be in, you know, for the light or whatever it is, right? Like the idea that that would be seen as crazy, but to numb yourself out like a cat who's not comfortable in a cage, like you put your cat in a vet's for the night and they're too erratic, so the vet just gives it something to just calm it down. That you would just give yourself in effect something like that, and that is a better solution, is crazy. And it gets worse when you talk about transitioning. The thing you see with a lot of these, in the case of this Mrs. Fun or whoever else, these people who kill themselves because they or euthanize themselves because they feel depressed. Excuse me. The people who do that, there's often this kind of comorbidity, if you can call it that, of autism. You also see that with trans. Now, obviously, that's very pronounced. I don't really understand it too well, but it's a sort of it varies. There's a spectrum, but people can be in heightened emotional states and more sort of sensitive and all of that. And it makes sense, basically more predisposed to being mentally unwell or unhappy or anxious. And so if you see that with the euthanasia people and you see it with the trans people, and it's kind of co-linked to those things, and it's also co-linked to general mental health issues or just being unhappy, then clearly people don't actually like necessarily need to trans. As in, if it's a coincidence that a lot of those people, like a huge proportion of them, are just autistic, it's just a mental health issue. I hope I'm not violating anything here, but in my view, YouTube, I really want to set up a Rumble so I can just go off and slur my way, say whatever I want about whatever I feel is right. But I don't want to use slurs, but you get what I mean. I can use whatever language I want. But those people are the leading edge of mentally unwell people, basically, is what I'm saying. And they don't all have to be autistic, but it shows that it's not about, obviously, euthanasia or trans. Really, it's just about a sickness within the human condition, and then a society that is going about it completely the wrong way. Probably not to be a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but that's by design. Like, the society is by design failing to address the basic questions of what the good life is for people in general, and how best to solve the eternal question of perpetually being ultimately dissatisfied, awkward, unhappy, in pain, lonely, all of these things. How does a society ameliorate that, and how does it maximize without offering happiness, so-called. Stella O'Malley's video is very good on the false promise of happiness, but without offering some utopian version of happiness, setting the conditions that are most conducive to the best we can hope for. The fact that we're always going to have a funny feeling, and we're designed that way, and for a good reason biologically, but to make it so that that's not so bad. So I need only refer to a basic traditional society, and by I don't mean ridiculous trad, cartoon trad. I mean normal traditions that have existed for the entirety of human civilization up until like 50 years ago in the West, basically. So I'm referring to basically the majority of time and place in all of history. So it's nothing obscure, but you know, so you need only refer back to that and see the commonalities. The commonalities are, of course, that you have within reason, you have gender roles. You have women are raised in a certain way. Not, again, caveat, not everybody needs to be everything, or not everybody needs to follow an exact prescription, but generally speaking, on a mass population sense, girls have a certain destiny that suits their biological makeup, and they're raised in keeping with that, as are boys, as are different types of people, different proclivities and all of this. They're raised in a certain way so that you minimize the chaos, you allow a certain amount of maneuverability within that, and freedom, you could call it, but a limited amount. A little bit of mobility and all of that in different directions for different types of people. But in general, you make the society conducive to the majority and to the basic. You basically deal with reality. The whole idea of multi-generational families, in some sense, whether they all live under the one roof or close by or whatever. But, the idea that we've made that difficult for people, and now people who are aged between like 30 and 50 or whatever it is have to pay for their children to be raised by strangers, and then they have to pay for their parents to be looked after by African folks, right? You know the story there, or the whole crack with that. And if they're not paying for it, then their parents' entire assets will be liquidated in the paying for it. That is nuts. It doesn't make sense. The idea that people have religion, faith, that they bow their heads and they pray, even if not everybody totally believes it in the fullest sense or whatever, but the idea that you promote the idea of faith, the same way in Iran, not everybody is being whipped and harassed and harangued about Islam, but there's a general reverence for the faith. I don't think it's at all as extreme as it's made out to be, but that's how it is. You go to somewhere like Uganda, and they're going to have their Africanized Protestantism or whatever it is, but they I should have said this earlier. You can leave a super chat, by the way, and you can also, through my link, you can follow my social media and you can support the channel as well. I definitely should have said that at the start. Would have been better for me, but anyway, I forgot. Always something. But so I'm just looking at the chat. It reminded me. But you would have those things, and so the human condition would be there. You would have tortured authors and painters and architects and everything else, and ordinary people. Because the human condition would always be there. I'm not saying that the utopia is to return to tradition and you would fix everything for people, but it's that society would generally be, it's so common sense, it's crazy, that it would be geared towards giving people the best solution to this insoluble problem that you can, making it so that there are days spent. I always think about dances, like we have the Cayley in Ireland, but if you go to Norway, if you go to Algeria, if you go to Japan or whatever, every country will have sort of something along those lines, and they all developed independently. The idea that, this is kind of obscure, but they would all have this dance, and it's not a dance where you go get wasted in coppers and you try and get the shift and like ruin your life and get too drunk and get kicked out. It's not like that. It's not sordid and ridiculous like that. It's that it's not an individual thing. Everybody lines up. There's a line of 8 people, and it's a kind of prescribed dance, and you dance a certain way, and there can even be kids involved. There's an old lady there, and there's a puppy love couple looking across at each other, and the older people are watching that and keeping that in mind, and all of this kind of stuff. And there's this society, the dance, that general dance that exists in every culture. is an example of that. That people all go, people within an entire community all go to it. They don't all live in little boxes alone. These things were designed to keep people from taking the euthanasia pill effectively, or wanting to like numb themselves out on drugs. It made it so that, yes, you have existential everything, dread and anxiety, but you go to that dance, you come back, you go do this, you go do that, you go pray. You might even pray, and as you're sitting there, your mind is wandering, thinking, how much do I believe it? But you're trying, you're into it anyway, you're trying. And you come out and you say, yes, I do actually feel better. And people are just more normal. I think it would be that way if you went to Iran. It was like that if you go back in Ireland, even 20, 30 years. People were just less weird, So I don't know. Stella O'Malley got me thinking about this question, and then I read up on this euthanasia thing. It's such an important question, and it's not like I'm waxing lyrical about it, or that she is when we talk about this, that the society isn't really geared very well towards dealing with it. We're talking about euthanasia. We're talking about like cutting children's genitals off effectively, young people or anyone's, and chemically, what's it called? Transitioning. What's even the word for it? Chemically castrating effectively people. Like, when you're in that territory, it's not unreasonable, or it's not highfalutin to step back and say, let's not just talk about the outrage of those phenomena, but let's talk about the absence, the hole that is creating this industry. It's not just being created from the top down, in the sense that they're creating the outrage of these acts like euthanasia and transitioning. It's that the worst crime, in a way, in a sense, is that they're not that they're offering that and that they're promoting that. The worst crime, in a sense, is that they are creating the conditions whereby people are looking for something like that and see solutions and things like that, as opposed to just a normal society where people sort of find their place, they feel content to some extent, and they believe in their own death, they believe in perhaps something after it, and they accept the futility of looking for some version of utopian happiness that you think somebody else has. It's something I'd love to talk about a lot, with people. Okay, I'm just going to go to chat now. I'm kind of over it. I think I've said my piece on that. I don't know. I never know if a stream is good or bad, or if I'm like totally rambling, or if it's interesting or not. But so yeah, that was that. How was it? Was it bad? Was it good? I don't know. Everybody's saying F. What's F about? Can someone tell me that? So yeah. I don't know what else there is to talk about. I think that's it. I think I'll leave it there. What did I talk about tomorrow night? Something. I'll figure something out. But yeah, so that's the pact. I'm not sure, to be honest, how to push back on it, or what the answer is for it. I don't know. Someone might come up with a way, because we can't all just be against it and like that's it. There has to be some sort of path. I think it's call your TDs. I think I've never done it, to be honest. It's not my kind of thing, but some other people are good at that. Email campaigns and stuff. I'm not sure. Petitions. I don't know. Is this what we've been reduced to? But someone says I have opposition in the chat. Perhaps I have stalkers in the chat. It's been a while. I blocked all the kind of Antifa, NGO people, stalkers and all that. I kind of blocked them. I was like an idiot for a long time. I didn't block them. It's just a waste of time, a waste of energy. But yeah, look, I'll leave it there, and I'll be back soon. I very much enjoy doing these. I'm grateful that some of you watch and stick around, because it's nice to be able to do it, and I enjoy talking about this stuff. But yeah. Armchair Limerick Nationalist gives €2. Thanks very much. Thanks for the ramble, girl. You're very welcome. Yeah, go on. Look, I'll see you. Actually, I won't see you tomorrow. I'll see you soon. Yeah, I've got something on tomorrow night. The following night. We'll be back then. See you.